This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, to kick off the new year, your host Michael Green speaks with former Victorian Ombudsman Deborah Glass, OBE. After completing her law degree at Monash, Deborah headed straight overseas to begin decades working in many interesting and varied roles, none of which were in the law. She worked in the financial services sector in Europe, was Senior Director of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission, and became the Deputy Chair of the Independent Police Complaints Commission in the UK. Deborah returned to Australia and became the Victorian Ombudsman in 2014, and over her 10 years in the role, led many significant investigations and reform efforts, including, of course, the unprecedented issues the COVID-19 pandemic gave rise to. Over the years, many of our guests have veered in and out of the law throughout their careers. But perhaps more than any, Deborah knew very early on that although she would use her legal skills throughout her career, a life in the law would not be her path.
I've never been a planner, but I knew on the first day I started my articles, and I took the first offer of articles I cast my bread upon the waters, sent off thousands of applications, did not give any thought as to the type of firm I wanted to work for, the type of law I might want to specialise in, none of that. I just needed to do articles and started this job. And I remember standing there on the station platform early in the morning, to catch my train into work, thinking, what the hell am I doing? And when I was coming back that night, it was even more so. It was, what on earth have I got myself into? And I just knew on that first day I didn't want to be a lawyer.
Our guest this morning in Lives in the Law is Deborah Glass. In March of 2024, Deborah retired as Victoria's Government Ombudsman after 10 years in that role. Deborah, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Deborah, you've had a storied career, multifaceted career, over 40-odd years, taking you from Melbourne to Switzerland, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, London, back to Melbourne. So it's a big journey. And I'm interested to go on the journey about how a Melbourne girl took that journey. But take us back to the start. Where were you born? How did you grow up? School, parents, etc. Just set the scene for us.
I was born in Bega, actually, in New South Wales. So technically I'm a country girl, although I have very little memory of the time because I was only there for a few years when my father was the local GP in a little tiny town called Cobargo.
What got you back to Melbourne? Where did you go to school?
I went to school in Melbourne, so my parents then went off to England for a couple of years and then came back to Melbourne. So I grew up in Melbourne and I went to school in Melbourne. I went to a Jewish school here, and you're probably going to ask me why I did law. And actually that's a direct answer to my upbringing, because I was a good student and I couldn't stand the sight of blood. And, that's a kind of Jewish joke really, but it's true. If you're a good student and you're a nice Jewish girl, I'm not sure that I really was, but that's probably how I was perceived at the time. You did law or medicine. And
I think Jewish or otherwise, if you went to certain schools in Melbourne, i.e. the private schools, that's what you did. Well, and so it was law.
There was an expectation that so it was a kind of sort of pre-programmed track. So I was vaguely interested in law, but I knew very little about it. I just knew it was quite hard to get into, and I could get into it. And at first it was just this enormous relief to be finished with school and school days, and there was this tremendous sense of liberation. But I did make a conscious decision to choose Monash over Melbourne because of its social justice program. And I'm talking about the 70s. Monash was the radical university. It was the upstart. It had poached all the best and brightest from Melbourne. And that was attractive.
Some people may disagree with that.
I know, but I thought I may as well be a little controversial. Although a lot of people would agree, Louis Waller, Ron McCall, wonderful, wonderful people.
Did you enjoy university?
I had a wonderful time there, but I didn't work very hard.
Hard enough to pass.
Hard enough to pass.
Now, I read somewhere that at the age of 17, I repeat, 17, you were the editor of the student newspaper.
Yeah, it was my first year. It was one of those sort of odd things. You know, I mean, what I really wanted to be when I was a teenager was a journalist. You know, I had vague notions of saving the world. You know, hence the attraction to Monash and its sort of social justice program. So when I first started at Monash in my first year, I volunteered at Lot's Wife. Just, you know, did a couple of stints there. And then extraordinarily, sort of halfway through that year, there was one of those sort of political upheavals that happens in student politics when the last remaining bastions, I think, of the anarchists who controlled, you know, vast chunks of Monash at the time, who were editing the student paper, were finally levered out of position and needed to be replaced. So those who had replaced the anarchists were sort of casting around for people who could take over the editorship of Lot's Wife, and I found myself in pole position as one of several people who was willing to do this.
I would have thought that editing a newspaper, even a student newspaper, Lot's Wife, was quite a onerous position, not something you just pick up as a kid straight out of school.
Jolly lucky to pass that year, because most people who took on Lot's Wife, you know, you take a year off and you focus on the newspaper. And I was, you know, trying to finish my first year of law. So it is quite remarkable, actually, that I even completed. I wasn't the sole editor. You know, there were three of us, so it wasn't as onerous as it might have been. But yeah, it was interesting, and I put on the front cover of our first edition, there's a wonderful Ronald Searle cartoon. I don't know whether, you know, you or your listeners know this, but it's got a couple of monsters behind a door that has editor on it, reading a letter to the editor, which says, "Sometimes I wonder if editors are human."
So you could laugh at yourself.
Oh, you have to.
You finish uni. Most of us in finishing university in those years, I was a bit ahead of you and chronologically, think we're going to go into practice, we're going to have a long career in the law, living here in Melbourne, and that's it. Did you have such a picture in your mind, considering the career you have had?
No, I didn't. I've never been a planner, but I knew on the first day I started my articles, and I simply, you know, I just took articles with, you know, I took the first offer of articles I cast my bread upon the waters, sent off thousands of applications, did not give any thought as to the type of firm I wanted to work for, the type of law I might want to specialise in, none of that. I just needed to do articles and started this job. And I have this vision, I still remember it, because I went out and bought myself a suit. I'd never had one of these before. And it was a navy blue gabardine, terribly conservative skirt suit. And I think the skirt went down, you know, almost to my ankles. It was deeply unfashionable and very appropriate for a young lawyer at the time. And I remember standing there on the station platform, you know, early in the morning, you know, to catch my train into work, thinking, well, you know, what the hell am I doing? And when I was coming back that night, it was even more so, it was what on earth have I got myself into? And I just knew on that first day I didn't want to be a lawyer.
And so what did you do during your articles? I mean, you actually stayed at the firm for a couple of years after you finished your articles.
I needed to earn some money. You might recall the days when articles was exceptionally badly paid. We were paid about half that of the tea lady, and that was the time when there were tea ladies. Yeah, I mean, article clerks were very much cheap labour. But look, it was a good firm. I basically worked in a special litigation practice.
Commercial litigation?
Commercial litigation. Actually, I did a lot of crash and bash. And I think what I learned from that, which did stand me in good stead to some degree in later life, was that litigation had very little to do with the law and everything to do with the art of bluff and counter-bluff, that you stare people down. I didn't realise it at the time, but, you know, decades later, when I was engaged in further art of bluff and counter-bluff, I suspect that early training in litigation was quite good for me.
So after a couple of years working as a young solicitor, you accumulated enough money, I assume, to go travelling.
Yes. I mean, you know, really, I'm talking about backpacking. So I worked, I think, about 3 years after I finished my articles, and I saved up enough to be able to leave the country on a one-way ticket with a rucksack on my back, knowing that I could sponge off, various relatives in Europe for accommodation, and that wasn't going to cost me a whole lot. So, and I still had, I think, vague, saving the world type notions, and I wanted to write. I still had these, feelings about journalism, but I realised incredibly quickly that was never going to pay even for repairs to my rucksack. That you've just got to, you've got to be a bit more practical. But I just wanted to leave. I had no sense of, no plan. I just knew I didn't want to be a lawyer in Australia. And I wondered about this later, because there are times when I thought, I could have decided to not be that kind of lawyer. I could have decided to go into public law or, some other specialisation or criminal law or anything. There are so many options in the law. But somehow I just chose not to pursue any of them. I didn't even ask the questions about what else was out there. I just thought, nope, not for me. I'm out of here.
10 months travelling around Europe, I think it was about 10. You're in Switzerland and you've got a job with a large international corporation.
A bank, in fact, which is what you do in Switzerland. Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well, that was pretty funny, actually. The secret here is that I have a Swiss passport, so that helps.
This is through one of your parents.
Through my father. Yeah, my father's father was born in Switzerland, and interesting, it's inherited down the male side of the family. Stopped with me, of course. So I had relatives there who I'd never met, who very kindly put me up, on my travels. And I just knew I didn't want to go back to Australia. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do next. And so it was something I fell into. I needed a job, and this leading international investment bank was looking for management trainees with people with several years' experience in, I remember the advert at the time was finance, accounting, economics or law. And I thought, okay, I've got that bit. I'll go for it. And I went for it without any desire or expectation that I even wanted to do that. But it was, so if I look back on my career, there are some things I've done because I really, really wanted to do them, and other things I've done because I didn't like the alternative. And this was the latter.
And so what did you do working for an international bank? Coming from Melbourne, doing commercial law, crash and bash, which is a long way from international banking.
It sure is.
So what did you do with this large bank?
Well, I started as a trainee, so, which for a few months. And then at the time, this was the mid-'80s. And anybody who's from, the Wolf of Wall Street, investment banking was the place to be, and they trained you. So I had a wonderful boss who just said, "Well, go find yourself courses for whatever you want to do." And I went off to New York and did the Series 7 stockbroking course. I went to London and did money markets and foreign exchange. I just went on. I learnt about the financial markets, and I found myself sort of quite by chance working for this guy who was setting up an investment fund business in Luxembourg. And he said, I could do with somebody with legal training to help me with my prospectuses. And I went from there to basically learning how to run the business.
Were you using the legal skills and the legal knowledge you had obtained?
Good question. Probably indirectly, I suspect I have used my analytical training as opposed to, the pure legal training in every job I've done. But it's only now in reflection that I realise how useful my legal training was for me, because I certainly felt that I'd left the law behind and had absolutely no interest in going back to it.
But that analytical ability which the law gives you held you in very good stead.
It did, yes. Not to mention the what I learned about the art of litigation, staring people down.
So Switzerland, Luxembourg. I think the next stop is Hong Kong.
It was, yes. Look, banking was fascinating, really was. I learnt an immense amount about the financial markets, particularly with a focus on collective investments, unit trusts. And I found it really interesting. But I realised, and this is where values starts to kick in, and you never leave those behind. And at some point, if your career strays too far from your values, it's going to pull you back. And that's what I found happened to me. I loved the work. It was fascinating, and I was rapidly promoted in the job. I found myself, going from a trainee position to basically running a business within 4 years. And I was working with some very smart people, and I was learning a lot, and it was all terribly glamorous and exciting. Money was no object in those days. But I found, and this is what happens when you get onto the kind of corporate track, you have to be obsessed with the corporate bottom line, and you've got to demonstrate you're obsessed with the corporate bottom line. And frankly, I didn't care about the corporate bottom line. I mean, I could talk the talk. I knew how to do a presentation on, what you used to tongue-in-cheek call the corporate hockey stick, which is the profit line you're going to demonstrate over the next, 5 years of the business. But I didn't care about it. I found the business fascinating, the nature of it. And I was working quite a lot with regulators, but I realised that was not developing the bank's profits was not going to be my role in life.
So how did you wind up in Hong Kong?
The bank had sent me out to Hong Kong and quite a few other places around Southeast Asia around the time of the 1987 market crash, which, listeners with all, long enough memories and have grey hairs will remember, which was a hell of a time to be in financial services. I mean, it really was a shock, that crash. And I was in Hong Kong around the time the Hong Kong markets were closed by a later who was formerly found to be corrupt or just believed to be, chair of the stock exchange who didn't want to lose any money. So he shut the exchange.
So that his shares wouldn't plummet.
Exactly. So it was a major scandal, of course, for Hong Kong. And it resulted in the Hong Kong government deciding they needed to bring in a proper independent professional regulator for the financial markets to clean it up, because international investors, of course, were disappearing fast, and they were keen to restore confidence in the market.
And so what job did you get?
Well, I knew this new commission was being set up, because when I was in Hong Kong. And
this is the Hong Kong
Securities and Futures Commission. Yeah. And I thought, this is for me. So, when I mentioned earlier, there are some jobs you just want to go for. I knew I wanted that job. I knew that I would be really good for this commission and that it would be good for me.
Can I just stop you there? Can you enlighten us as to, you must have had a lot of experience in this. How old were you at the time?
I was still in my 20s.
I found that surprising.
Yeah. It was, I was still in my 20s and I just thought, this is for me. I want to do this. And it was, there were some funny moments around that, because I'd met at the time I was living in Switzerland and I was only temporarily in Hong Kong. And while I was there, I met the people who were setting up this new commission, introduced myself and said, I'd really like to work here. And they said, well, that's great. We've got to set this up. It'll take some time. Here's the org chart. And I looked through the org chart and I looked at this position and I said, that's me. There it was. There was a senior manager of the unit trust division, which was responsible for regulating unit trusts in Hong Kong. And I just knew that I'd be perfect for that. So I kept ringing this. I went back to Switzerland and I kept ringing this woman every month to say, how's my job going? Have you advertised it yet? And it became a bit of a standing joke. But in the end, it was advertised. I applied and I got it.
Deborah, it's interesting you've had a significant period working for a large bank. Obviously, it's a capitalist organisation driven by the profit motive, but then you see a job and you say it's the perfect job for you, acting as a regulator. Why? What made you see this job and think, that's me?
Look, no offence to the profit motive. I mean, it is important. It plays a role in our society. But what I found was that it didn't align with my values. And I realised that for me, I needed to be somehow working in the public interest, that I'm a public sector person at heart. So while the business of financial markets was fascinating, what I wanted to do was help to control them. I wanted to use this knowledge I had gained from the banking world and use it in practical ways so that small investors could be protected, for instance, that they weren't going to be ripped off.
I want to go back a bit. Would you trace those values back to your parents?
Yes, my parents, my community, yes, all of the above, absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess that's most of us in the apple and the tree.
Yeah, and social justice was something that I grew up in a community of Holocaust survivors. So when you're talking about social justice and human rights, it's sort of in your DNA.
So you stay in Hong Kong for maybe 8 years?
It was closer to 10, yes. But it was, it felt like a lot more than that, because if you work in the financial markets, you measure things in market cycles, and a normal market cycle is sort of 3 to 5 years. In Hong Kong, it was about every 5 minutes. You really were. This was in the run-up to the handover back to China, and it was fascinating because there were unique investment schemes, immigration schemes that you would only find in a place like Hong Kong, where people would be pooling their money to invest in something that was going to get them a passport. So, where else in the world does that kind of thing happen?
And I'm assuming Hong Kong was, and I assume always has been and still is, an extremely dynamic place, dynamic commercially.
Absolutely.
And you're therefore working to try to control that dynamism for the public good. Why did you leave it?
Well,
to go back to London, I should have said.
Well, it wasn't really more for personal reasons at this stage. I did love it. It can be quite exhausting, this kind of work. I could have stayed with it, but I was also ready to move on. I mean, living in a huge city of, 7 million plus people, very little space, very polluted, with all the problems that go with that. I was ready to do something else, and really for personal reasons. I just got married at this point. My then husband lived in London, and thought, well, why not give that a whirl?
Upon arriving in London, how did you find a job? Was it easy to find a job?
Well, I had a job before I left because in the world of financial regulation, I was quite active in the sort of international Securities Commissions organisation, so I knew a lot of my peers in other regulatory bodies. And I was asked by my peer in the UK, who had just been appointed to this new Financial Services Authority, if I would come and sort of mind the fort for him in this transition period in the UK where all these self-regulatory bodies were being merged into a single regulator. So he asked me to come along essentially to hold the fort in this self-regulatory body called the Investment Management Regulatory Organisation that regulated the fund managers in the UK.
The fund managers specifically?
Yes.
And was that a long-term job for you, or did you just do that holding the fort and then move on?
Well, the intention was, he said, look, can you come along for 6 months and just hold the fort? Because it was all going to be merged into this new authority, so it was never going to be a long-term job. I loved regulation. I wanted to do that forever. And I thought, well, that'll be good. And it'll probably be quite a good intro to helping me get a job in the new regulator, quite possibly. But I didn't reckon on my coming into endless conflict with the new regulator in that role. So, which is what happened.
Endless conflict within the organisation you were working?
No.
The new one that you were...
The new one.
Was going to take your place.
Yes, essentially. Look, what I ended up doing for 2.5 years, and it was a pretty thankless job, was running this self-regulatory organisation, which still had legal responsibilities, even though it had essentially transferred its assets over to the new regulator. And I stayed because I was asked by the board, who were sort of non-executive. And this is a bit of a gender story, actually, that I will share with you. The chairman of the board, who was dare I say, quite a stuffy Scot. They were all gentlemen of the city, this board, completely non-executive, gentlemen of the city board. And they asked me if I would stay for a couple of years and keep looking after their interests until. Can
I just clarify? This is a statutory body?
Yes, but it continued to exist as a legal entity for another couple of years, which is a very unsatisfactory place for these directors to be, because they retained their directors' responsibilities and they needed somebody on the ground to make sure that the work was being done. And that was tricky because all the assets had been transferred, including the staff, to the new authority. So I knew it was not going to be a pretty task, but I also knew that it needed to be done. And I decided that I would do it if they appointed me to the board as chief executive. And I had this moment thinking to myself, well, let's just see whether these gentlemen of the city let me join their club. I was very aware that I had what you might describe as a triple disability, because I was a woman, I was an Australian, and I was a Jew. Now, all three of those things do not go down well in, British establishment circles. And I thought, well, let's see whether these gentlemen of the city will let me join their club. And if they do, then I'm willing to help them out.
And did they?
They did.
And then you had another 2 years, was it, with that?
Yes. So I was appointed to the board and formally appointed as chief executive of IMRO. And in that time, I battled for the interests of my board and earned the undying enmity of the new authority. So that was the end of my career in financial regulation.
So you didn't transfer across to the new authority?
I did not. No.
You soon thereafter, though, are involved with bodies, plural I think, who were handling complaints against the police in the UK.
Yes, well, again, I go back to my career change chart. You know, this was a classic example of doing something because I'd eliminated the things I didn't want to do. And it was just something else, you know, it was not so this was, I didn't want to go back into the private sector. You know, the obvious thing for me to do at the time was become a international compliance director for some leading fund management house. And when I talked to headhunters, that was what they would say. Oh, wonderful with your regulatory background and all the things you've done. Perfect job for you. Lots of money. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do that. I'm not interested. So I did a lot of thinking about what mattered to me. And I realized that what mattered was staying in the public sector somehow, but regulation was now gone for me. It had been closed off. So what is there? What's out there? And I saw an advertisement one day for something called the Police Complaints Authority. And I remember the salary was on the advert. And I had one of those kind of Naomi Campbell moments, I'm not suggesting for a moment there's a parallel there, but she would say, I don't get out of bed for that kind of money. And I had the same feeling, well, terrible salary, I'm not going to waste my time going for a job like that. But then you think about it, and that's what I did. And I thought, actually, what matters to me, it's not the money. It is the work and the kind of work I can do and the contribution I can make. And it sounds kind of interesting. And I've been doing some voluntary stuff when I first moved to the UK. And one of the voluntary things I was doing was working as what's called a lay visitor, where you make unannounced visits to police stations to make sure people in custody are being treated properly. So I had a bit of an interest already in police-community relations. And I thought, well, I might just apply for this job, even though the pay is appalling. Or so it felt to me at the time.
And that application was successful? As
it turned out, yes. But the funny thing is, that when I first applied, I was very ambivalent about whether I even wanted to do it. But it was this incredibly long and arduous process. And by the end of it, by the time I was asked to come for a final round interview, I decided I wanted it, and I got it.
Is this authority, have you got a staff of 100 people, 1,000 people, or are you a standalone person? Or?
Well, good question, because I found myself unexpectedly in an environment where the authority was being replaced. And it was only going to be in existence for a few years, and then it was going to be replaced by this independent police complaints commission.
Again, statutory?
Again, absolutely, and powerful. So the authority I joined was part of a kind of push for reform, but it in itself was being replaced because it had been criticised for not having the powers strong enough to deal with the police. So this new commission, for the very first time in the UK, was going to have actual real police powers, and it was going to have the power to investigate independently itself rather than simply supervise a police investigation. So basically it was set up because of the lack of predominantly black and minority ethnic community confidence in the police investigating themselves for such things as deaths following police contact.
Did you see much of deaths following police contact? Was that a common
thing? I lived and breathed it for 13 years. It's grueling.
Do you have the training? Did you and did your staff have the training necessary to carry out this function?
When I started in my very first role, I would say my training was very little, common sense. But I remember the first time I was called out when a young black man died in Brixton Police Station, and I was called at the middle of the night to go out there and supervise a team of police officers who were carrying out the investigation. I remember thinking to myself, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm going to make it up. And I did, and it worked. And look, a lot of this is common sense, and probably the training I'd had in my early days was helpful, though I may not have recognised it at the time. But what I did do was go back to the office, the next Monday and go, right, we need formal investigations training, and we got it. So there was a lot of on-the-job training, as well as, both formal and informal.
So initially, you're supervising police who are investigating police.
Yep.
Highly unsatisfactory in my view. Then, because it was considered unsatisfactory by minority groups, they formed the Independent Police Complaints Commission.
Yes.
And you become the commissioner of that?
Yes. Yes.
And so
I had to apply. There was no transfer into that role, and many of my colleagues did not get jobs in the new commission, which was a matter of some deep disquiet, because we thought we'd been promised them when we agreed to take on this the carcass of this organisation in the first place. It was complicated.
You must have been frustrated then, and even now, I suspect, in all of this working life, working with politicians and having political issues always intervening and possibly sidetracking you.
I tried to avoid working with politicians. Some of them were unavoidable. But for the most part, I worked a lot with senior police. And when I was appointed to the commission, I'd had 3 really solid years of investigations behind me. So by this point, I knew my stuff, and I knew how to investigate, and I knew how to lead investigations, and I knew how to tell the police what to do, which was helpful, because if you my experience of managing police, they'll find you out very quickly if you don't know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Did I read somewhere where you said, and this may be an exaggeration, maybe I misread it, that this period of your working life with the Police Complaints Authority and the Independent Complaints Commission was entirely thankless?
It wasn't entirely thankless. And I was very devoted to it, and I am very proud of a lot of what I achieved during it. But there is something inherently thankless in the work of, to take a sadly common example, dealing with fatal shootings and deaths in custody. Because if you're dealing with, for example, the death of a young black man, the only sort of justice that man's family can imagine is a prosecution for murder for the police officer who's fired a shot. That's their view of justice. From the police standpoint, their view of justice is not even investigating it at all, because they're doing their job, they say. So where does that sit? Where is the truth? And what you're trying to do in that kind of role is walk a very, very difficult line. It's not about what happened. You know what happened. Why did it happen? Was it reasonable, proportionate, justifiable? What were the facts? And often they're very murky, and you'll never get to the answer. And you'll find yourself in the middle of this, abused from all sides.
Entirely thankless. One of the very, very high-profile investigations and reports you were involved in was to do with the Hillsborough disaster, which was a crowd at a soccer match involving the Liverpool Football Club, where 97, I think, people are crushed to death because of overcrowding. Everyone was standing, and it was a standing area, I seem to remember.
Yes.
And people were crushed to death. It happened in 1989. You do a report, or you were involved in the setting up of the report, and it's released in 2012.
An absolutely appalling tragedy. If ever there was a blot on the justice landscape, and there have been many in the United Kingdom, this was a really serious blot. Sorry,
can I just clarify, Deborah? Why was it a blot?
There had been a series of inquiries, multiple inquiries into the Hillsborough disaster that started immediately. There was no 23-year wait for an investigation. The initial inquest verdicts were accidental death. The coroner limited the evidence that he was prepared to hear. There were judicial inquiries that, for one reason or another, never really got to the heart of it or got to the truth. And the families of the victims and the survivors they kept on lobbying for justice. So if there was one word that still stands out for me about my experience of Hillsborough, it is the fight for justice, the pursuit for justice. So for 23 years there was this. Every successive new British government was lobbied need for another inquiry, another something that was, that might deliver justice. And the report that was delivered in 2012, which was the year before the end of my term, was not an investigation. It wasn't an inquiry. It was actually a narrative. It was a collection of documents that was published to really quite explosive effect towards the end of that year. And what it revealed was the culpability of, particularly of police, and the appalling nature of the cover-up that happened after the deaths.
Why was there a need for a cover-up? Because it looked to be an accident and too many people. Maybe there was lack of occupational health and safety regulations.
It wasn't an accident. It was the result of absolutely appalling policing, appalling operational decisions, appalling communication. Quite likely that lives would have been saved if things had been done differently.
Can I just take you back to the start of maybe the Hillsborough investigation you did, or narrative? Can I get you to read what you said in a public meeting to the survivors and I think you'll remember it. Yeah. Can I get you to read that, please? And this is you speaking to a room or a theatre full of people whose loved ones have died at Hillsborough.
I'm not going to pretend that I know what it's like 23 years later to still be in the pain you're in. But I want you to know that I can hear your pain and your grief. I'm not going to make you promises I can't keep. I can't promise that this or that police officer is going to go to jail, and it's not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. But I ask you to judge me on what we do, not on what we say or what others will say about us.
I'm sure that had an impact on the people because there was no glossing over.
What I was really conscious of, and what I did with Hillsborough is that after this narrative was released in 2012, is that I launched a fresh investigation, it turned out to be the largest criminal and misconduct investigation into policing in, I imagine, the history of Western Europe. I've never actually added them all up, but I would be very surprised if it were not. But I knew at the time that it was going to be, the toughest call was going to be persuading the people affected, the victims and the families, that we were going to deliver some sort of justice. And this is where the whole concept of justice becomes, pretty slippery, actually. Because people don't want the same thing. They have different ideas of justice. For some of the families, all they wanted was that terrible inquest verdict to be overturned, to be, the accidental death verdict, because it wasn't accidental. It was negligent. It was appalling. It was, in some cases, deliberate, and there were lies that were told. They wanted vindication. Some families wanted police in prison, and everything in between. And what I was conscious of 23 years later was that some of these things were just never going to be possible, because what you know as an investigator is that the passage of time is very damaging to investigations. Evidence disappears, people can't remember, people die, all of these things that happened. And the ability, right at the start, that the chances of there being successful prosecutions at the end of this are going to be very, very, very slim indeed, as indeed was proved to be the case. But what really mattered was that people were heard and vindicated after decades of lies and abuse.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Greens List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Greens List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
So, Deborah, we're now in the year of 2014 and you return to Melbourne and you take up the role of Victorian Government Ombudsman. Did you come back to take up that role, or was that coincidental?
It was coincidental. I was planning to come back anyway. I was looking for a job in Melbourne, and certainly coincidentally, the 10-year term of the previous Ombudsman came to an end at precisely the moment that my term in the UK also expired. So I applied for it.
Can you educate us a bit, please, on the Ombudsman, what the role is, what power the Ombudsman has, where the Ombudsman sits in our framework of government?
Funnily enough, I didn't know any of these things when I applied for the job, and I hadn't even read the Ombudsman Act. So I was pleasantly surprised to discover what wonderful powers the Ombudsman had. You know, the powers of a standing royal commission, effectively. It is a very powerful role. It is one of the pillars of the integrity framework in the state, along with the Auditor General and the IBAC Commissioner. And it has a number of functions, but really the key function that most people will be aware of is dealing with complaints about government services, state and local government. And there are over 1,000 state and local government entities that you can complain about.
And so if I'm unhappy with something my local council's doing or not doing, I can make a complaint to the Office of the Ombudsman.
You certainly can, and thousands of people do.
Well, now, I want to take up two things from that. One, I guess maybe the second one we'll get to is how do you decide what you'll look into? But two, are you only able to look into, are you bound by complaints that are made to you, or can you initiate investigations yourself?
You can, and that's one of the lovely things about the role and its many powers is in own motion, own initiation powers. So as long as it's a matter in jurisdiction, if it looks troubling, it might be something you've read about in the news, or a pattern of complaints that seem to suggest that something is fundamentally wrong with public administration, or just maybe even just a good idea you've had in the bath. They're all open to the Ombudsman to decide to investigate.
So how do you decide what to investigate?
Well,
you've got limited resources.
Absolutely, and that's always the limiting factor. But it's I used to describe this very much as an art rather than a science, because you do need to want to make sure that you stay as relevant as possible to the public and that you're acting in the public interest as much as possible. So, and there are so many potential agencies and issues that you could turn over. So I found myself being very driven by patterns of complaints or topical issues. So, for example, there were a lot of complaints about workers' compensation claims, particularly complex area because, there's a whole series of channels for dealing with litigation involving workers' comp. And one of the things the Ombudsman does not do is replace the channels. So if you can go to a court or tribunal to get your matter resolved, generally the Ombudsman does not get involved. So the Ombudsman can look at these complaints and go, well, we're not going to look into the substance of this matter because, you've got all these rights at, conciliation and so on. But you can. And at one point in my first couple of years decided we were getting a lot of complaints about complex workers' comp matters, and decided to dig in a bit deeper to have a look at those. And that resulted in two major reports that I ended up tabling in Parliament. I'm not sure whether you saw a Four Corners program sometime, I think in 2020, called Immoral and Unethical, which were words I used about the workers' compensation system.
They're strong words.
They were deserved, I'm sorry to say, because what we found in that was a really massive systemic failures of the systems that should have been in place to protect workers. And it resulted in some significant reform eventually.
That was going to be my question. You said you table reports in Parliament. Over your 10 years, what was the history of your reports being acted on?
Pretty good. 96% implementation rate.
That's better than pretty good.
Yeah, very good, yes. But what was important to me was not only to have government say, yes, we're going to tick the box and say we'll do that, but to follow up. And that was what was compelling about the workers' compensation matter, because I did one investigation where I was very, very critical of the way the system worked and its failures. There was a lot of pushback at the time from WorkSafe and from the agents, and there was a bit of a narrative that we just found a few bad apples and this wasn't really wasn't that bad. So I made some probably less radical recommendations than I would have otherwise. But what I found was that complaints kept continuing. And that said to me, that was not good enough. So that I launched a second investigation on the back of those continued complaints, and hence the much more powerful recommendations that were made a couple of years later that were in fact taken up and did result in actual legislative change.
I liked a couple of words that you've used to describe how you make decisions about what to investigate. One was that you triage things, and the other you talked about a boiling pot.
Yes. Well, every ombudsman knows the art of triage, because you get, when you're dealing with, potentially tens of thousands of complaints a year, and they will range from, you get, including the trivial and the vexatious, through to matters that are really, really serious. As well as all the other stuff that comes in, including the whistleblower matters that get referred from IBAC, all of which consumes vast amounts of resources. So somehow in the middle of that, you've got to work out what you look at and what you don't. And there are many ways of, tools at your disposal to help you do that. I developed we called it a rather tongue-in-cheek way of looking at issues where things might be simmering away these might be bubbling away in the boiling pot because we're actively investigating them, like workers' comp. They might be simmering, so there's a pattern of complaints. We're not quite sure where that's going. It might go somewhere or it might not. So I might have tasked somebody in the office to look at those patterns of complaints just to see whether there is something in there that is worth a greater level of attention.
So you were the head chef in the kitchen.
Absolutely, but I wasn't it was a busy kitchen, and there's lots of ingredients getting dropped into the pot on a regular basis.
Now, you were ombudsman during COVID, which is very fresh in all of our minds, and I think that led to several reports about the way the government and government departments were handling the COVID issues. Could you take us down that track a little bit about, public housing, of course, we all remember seeing the Housing Commission buildings, particularly up in Carlton in my mind's eye, where people were locked down. Border closures affected a lot of us. I know they affected my wife and I on one occasion. Can you take us through that and how, can I say, and I said this to you off air, I was prepared to cut the government a fair bit of slack during COVID because I thought they're acting, there's no precedent, they don't know exactly what to do, and therefore they need to be conservative in their decision-making to try and protect us, the public. But some of your reports maybe says that wasn't the case. Well,
let's talk about human rights, because one of the, and we haven't talked about this yet, but actually the Ombudsman is Victoria's human rights investigator, among other things. And if there's one thing that really came to the fore for all of us during COVID, it was human rights in ways that I don't think any of us had ever thought about before. So those of us who work associated with the law, familiar with these things, know about the Human Rights Act, for example, know that there is a human right to humane treatment when you're deprived of liberty. Now, I don't know about you, but I always thought that involved prisons and, things like prisons. None of us ever thought that it would happen to all of us, but every single one of us was deprived of our liberty by the state during COVID. So that cast a whole new perspective, I think, on human rights and the nature of the balancing act that is human rights in ways that I certainly hadn't thought of before, and I suspect most Victorians also hadn't. So let's talk about lockdowns. I agree. And I, like you, I would cut the government plenty of slack. We got complaints about lockdowns generally. We got complaints about vaccine mandates. I did not choose to investigate those because, on balance, didn't seem like a bad idea. And the fact is that, that human rights are not absolute. We also have a right to life, and if this particular, balancing act is going to make other people sick, then, sorry, but you're not free to congregate. But what happened in the public housing towers was, for me, it crossed the line. And I didn't know that when I started the investigation. All I knew was that this was an issue that needed to be looked at. And when I saw the images of the people in the public housing towers who were locked down without any warning, I knew we had to look into that, and we did. And what I found in that investigation, through evidence given by the acting chief health officer on the day, was that she hadn't advised that these towers had to be locked down without any warning whatsoever. We all had notice of lockdowns, every single one of us. If we think back on, I've lost track of how many lockdowns there were, but every time we were locked down, we were told it was going to happen some hours later. So we all had time to, nip into the chemist or get our supplies or whatever it is we felt we needed. That did not happen to the 3,000 residents of the public housing towers. And essentially, it felt like it was it was dealt with as a security matter rather than a public health one.
and you tabled a report stating that. Was there anything that could be done about it, or was it all too late?
Well, what I concluded in that report was that the human rights of those 3,000 people had been breached not by the lockdown in itself, but by the immediacy of the lockdown, the fact that they had no notice of it. And for many of them, and many of these came from refugee backgrounds, and the first they knew was there were police surrounding their homes and they couldn't go out. I mean, it was positively traumatizing for so many people. It was, among other things, profoundly insensitive. But I recommend, one of the few recommendations I made that was not accepted by the government was that they apologise to the 3,000 people in the towers. The response I got was a pretty flat no, but I made several other recommendations there that were, even if they weren't accepted, people did things very differently a year later. And what was fascinating about that experience, that lockdown that I was critical of was in July of 2020. Almost exactly a year later, there was another outbreak of COVID in the towers, and things were done very differently. It was treated as a public health emergency, not as a security alert. So, sometimes it's what they do, not what they say, that matters.
Yeah, and that's encouraging. Also, issues arose about grants, financial grants, where people were adversely affected.
Yes, I mean, this is a really interesting example of where governments actually can do a better job as a result of the Ombudsman, and did so. And people remember that, when the lockdowns hit and small businesses were particularly badly affected by it, that the government brought in a series of grants to small businesses, which was welcomed. We began getting complaints very quickly about people whose grant applications were being turned down. And they were being turned down for really silly reasons, like a typo in an application form, or they'd missed something, got the wrong number on something, So technically it was a you've made a mistake, sorry, we're not looking at it, go away. And these from some of them were people who had never used computers before and were having to fill out application forms, were very unsure what they were doing, and it was just not fair. So we began looking into these complaints and looking into the measures that the department had put into place to these grants. And again, you've got to cut them some slack, because they had to bring in this grant system incredibly quickly, in the space of a week or so, and they made a lot of mistakes. But they were also willing to learn. So full credit to the department and the government for that. They actually did change their practices. They did go back and revisit a whole bunch of decisions. And I'm really proud to say that one of the outcomes of that investigation was something over $40 million got paid out to small business owners whose grants initially had been refused.
And that's a happy ending.
It's not that uncommon in my world. You do get the occasional happy ending. But what I was particularly pleased about in there, and this is where it was, it stood in contrast to the public housing towers, is that this was a case where I found that I was actively able to work with the government to achieve an outcome. Because the whole point is, you bring in a grants program to help people who need help, and they weren't getting it. You're missing your basic policy objective, guys. So it was getting that message across, which took a little effort but finally landed, meant that the outcome was a happy one all round.
I'd like to get back to the point of your relationship with government. I think that's interesting. Before I do, still under the umbrella of COVID, border closures were high profile. And I remember once we were in Canberra with seeing one of our sons and his family, and we were told they were closing the border at midnight that night. We better get back to Victoria. How did you become involved in the border closure issue?
Again, so many complaints. And what I expected when I took on the investigation it wasn't into the border closures, it was into the decision-making around who could come back and who couldn't. People were complaining about not getting exemptions. It was one of those times where I expected to find a system overwhelmed by demand. And actually what we found in this case was some really sad examples of just really downright poor decision-making by officials, and that massive amounts of effort were being put into keeping people out of the state than coming up with safe ways of getting them home.
And what was the outcome?
Well, One of the, aside from my being very critical, when you're dealing with these very real-time problems, what very often happens in my experience, and certainly happened in this case, is that when the Ombudsman announces that it's investigating something, things change very quickly after that announcement. So during the investigation, processes change. So within days of my announcing that I was going to investigate the decision-making around exemptions not being granted, the rules changed, and a whole lot of people who'd complained to us were able to get back into Victoria. So that's good. I mean, I was very happy to put out a report at the end and say, well, I'm glad to see they did the right thing eventually.
And didn't you call that the nudge of the Ombudsman's elbow?
I do call it the nudge of the Ombudsman's elbow. And it's, again, you talk about powers and, yes, it's wonderful to have all of these Royal Commission powers, but really I think the most impactful power the Ombudsman has is the persuasive powers that go with the role, that go with tabling a report in Parliament. Hearing
how your reports and these actions evolved coming out of COVID, the grants, the border closures and the high-rise flats, apartments, do we as a community have enough awareness of the Ombudsman and what the Ombudsman is there to do and what the Ombudsman can do for us? Oh, I'm sure not. I mean, the Ombudsman's office it punches well above its weight. I mean, considering the Ombudsman has a staff of, much more than 100 people dealing with, potentially tens of thousands of complaints a year, and the whistleblower matters and all the other stuff that forms part of its many functions. People generally have heard about the Ombudsman in the context of high-profile matters, and not everybody knows that you can go to the Ombudsman about your local council, the departments and agencies, so many, and also, how to make a good complaint. I mean, you've got to give your council a chance to pick up your bin, for example, before you complain to the Ombudsman if your bin's been missed. I used to talk about missed bins all the time. It's just, oh yes, we go from corruption to missed bins. That's the nature of the role. Is that it covers such a vast spectrum. But missed bins are important. But again, what do you want to get out of your complaint? You don't want an investigation. You want your bin to be collected, right? So so a lot of this is about how do you work with agencies, how do you work with councils to get them to do a better job? That takes me on to this issue of your relationship with the government and with councils, etc. How do they see you? Do they see you as the opposition, or do they see it as a collaborative arrangement? How do they see it? Well, it depends. I mean, I have certainly, in the 10 years I was in the role, there was certainly some ministers and departmental secretaries who were wonderful to work with and who really wanted to learn the lessons, who accepted that things had gone wrong, who wanted to get it to go better. Because fundamentally, when you're in the business of improving public administration, you'd think we would all want the same thing, whether you're a government minister or a departmental secretary of the Ombudsman, we want to do a better job. So that sometimes was the response, and sometimes you'd be welcomed with open arms with your reform suggestions, and you'd even work with agencies to come up with a good set of reforms that was going to be operationally sound. But doesn't always happen. Because some of us being human, we're defensive to criticism. Yes. And put aside our role as a government minister or whatever, we're just human beings. And so when we get criticised, we tend to put up the barriers and try to deny it maybe. Well, what I did try in the role to not do was simply make blanket criticisms. I always try to be as constructive as possible because fundamentally, you want people to do a better job. It's not about landing on people. And in my first year, in the role, I went around and met all the secretaries and ministers and said, look, this is, I'm the Ombudsman. I'm here to help you. That's the message I wanted to get across. But some things just happen in serendipitous ways. And there's no doubt that, that history played a part in my relations with the government. There are things that I did not expect that came to the fore. And cases like the public housing towers, where I was very critical, and I believe rightly so, which provoked a deeply defensive response. It sets up the appearance of conflict, even if you don't want it. What about the red shirts investigation or narrative? One of my early, it was an early referral, although it took some time to get off the ground. Referral by whom? From Parliament. Yeah, this is one of the interesting features of the Ombudsman role in Victoria, is that Parliament, either House of Parliament or a committee of Parliament, not an individual MP, can refer any matter to the Ombudsman. That's in the Ombudsman Act.
And the previous ombudsman had dealt with several such referrals. Not many. It's not a common occurrence, but there'd been a few. And I received the first of these in my second year on the job, and it was the red shirts matter that was referred by the Legislative Council, which of course the government did not control. It was a motion brought by the Greens, as I recall, and supported by the opposition. And it was asking me to investigate, in effect, alleged abuses of misuse of public funds prior to the 2014 election by the Labor Party for campaigning purposes. So what was being alleged it was called red shirts because the campaigners wore red shirts and they were being paid out of public funds to some degree as electoral officers, which was not what the money was there for. So that was a investigation that I certainly hadn't asked for, wasn't expecting, and found out about while I was on a tram. What's this?
That's very Melbourne, isn't it?
Very Melbourne, yes. I was on my way back from... I think I read it on Twitter. So I get back to the office and referral comes in that night from the president of the council, and I think, I better have a look at this. So I read the debate in Hansard from the previous day, and I could see that there was a very feisty debate about the Ombudsman's jurisdiction, where the government was arguing very strongly, the Ombudsman, that the government had no, objection to being investigated, but it would be discourteous to send this to the Ombudsman because she would not have the jurisdiction to do this, because she could not investigate members of Parliament. Whereas the Greens and others who were bringing this motion argued that indeed the Ombudsman did have jurisdiction. So I looked at this debate and thought, do I or don't I? Then I did a bit of research into the Ombudsman's archives and realised that the previous Ombudsman had been similarly challenged some years before about his jurisdiction to investigate government ministers. It had been questioned and he had asserted jurisdiction and it wasn't challenged. So he had in fact investigated previously. I was thinking to myself, well, if he's asserted jurisdiction, how would it look if I didn't? And there was a bit of a gender point there because I was very conscious of being the first woman to do the job. And I thought it would not be a good look for the office to simply bow to the government telling me I had no jurisdiction. It wasn't right. So I did think there's no point in getting another legal opinion. One of the lovely things about having been trained as a lawyer is that you don't feel beholden to people's legal opinions. Whereas non-lawyers feel that they have to get an opinion, they have to follow it. And I just thought, it's an opinion, We all have opinions. You can get an opinion for whichever way you wish to go. So I thought, I'm not going to waste any public money on getting another opinion, because there were opinions on the file from the previous ombudsman's work. So I thought, well, I'll write off to the minister and the council and say, I've read the debate and I can see there's questions about jurisdiction, but I can see this has been done previously and I'll get on with it, because it says the ombudsman must investigate. There's no other provision that requires that you must investigate something. No choice. So I was going to get on with it, and the response I got from that was an opinion of the Solicitor General telling me that I had no jurisdiction. And I have to say, I was rather peeved by that. Because if this had been provided to me, or even referenced in the debate, I probably would have just let it go. But it hadn't been provided to me.
And they had this opinion?
They'd had it for months.
Yeah.
They'd had it for months. Hadn't given it to me. I actually felt somewhat bullied by that. And I thought, I'm not going to just give in to that kind of behaviour. But I also felt that I probably had no jurisdiction. So I didn't want to waste public money starting an investigation, because as soon as I was going to exercise some sort of power, it would be challenged. So I thought, what's the best way of dealing with this? Well, right, I'm an independent officer of the Victorian Parliament. I'm going to go to the court and ask the court to tell me about my jurisdiction, because I have, I can do that under my act. And I confidently expected the Supreme Court to tell me I had no jurisdiction, and they didn't.
So you went to a judge alone in the Supreme Court, or did he?
So I initially applied to a judge alone, and I did this quite openly. I invited the government, the council, whoever wanted to join the proceedings, and it was one of those lovely legal proceedings where you brief counsel to say to the judge, well, the Ombudsman is neutral, Your Honour, if I can assist the court in any way. Because, of course, the government joined to argue that I had no jurisdiction, and the council, the President of the Council, joined to argue that I did, and they could fight it out between them. And
so a judge alone rules in your favour.
The government then appealed
to the Court of Appeal. What did?
Upheld the...
so the good guys are winning so far?
I remain neutral.
Sorry.
There's
no good and bad guys.
I remain neutral throughout this, but the attorney then sought leave to appeal to the High Court, and it was refused. So ultimately, it was confirmed that the Ombudsman had jurisdiction to investigate members of Parliament on a referral from Parliament itself.
Sounds important to me, although I guess it might mean that there will be very few referrals in the future.
Well, there actually were quite a number after that.
Oh.
So it started quite a trend of referrals, and I believe there have been some since my departure. So there are.
So
referrals
it was important.
It is an important provision.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
Now, tell us about your favourite complainant. There was a man who was your favourite complainant, which is, those sort of words often don't go together.
No. Well, this was an early piece of work by the office. And one of the things I wanted to do when I started this, I did not, walk into this role expecting that I was going to be having big fights with the government. In fact, I wanted to be collaborative. My expectation was that we'd be working together to achieve improvements in public administration for the greater good. You might say I was a little naive, but you've got to be a bit quixotic in a role like this. And otherwise, why would you do it? What was important, always been important for me, is fairness, the complexities of justice, which is much more complex than the law, the pure, black and white law would allow. So, fairly early on, and actually sort of going back for a moment, one of the things that I developed quite early on was this vision of fairness for the office. And it often be asked, why does the Ombudsman, what do you do? Why does the Ombudsman exist? And it's fundamentally about the imbalance of power between the individual and the state. That governments have this enormous power over people's lives. So what do you do when you're confronted by this overwhelming, power of the state that can make all of these incredibly important decisions about you? Well, there's an ombudsman there that can help you. There's a powerful body, and that's why the ombudsman has powers, that can help you to somehow redress that imbalance. So this imbalance of power was exemplified for me by a case that came in quite early on in my term from a resident in an aged care home. He was a man who was well into his 90s. His name was Alan Lorraine, and I can say this because his report, I tabled this report in Parliament. And he was resident, along with about 40 others, in an aged care home that had gone bankrupt. And when it went bankrupt, it took with them the bonds that the residents have paid to the tune of some millions of dollars. It was not a government facility, but it was regulated supposedly by the Department of Health. So when it went bankrupt, Alan Lorraine was convinced that something had gone wrong. And he, was an intellectually active man in his 90s. Who was pretty active on a typewriter, and he wrote letters to everybody under the sun to complain about this, this injustice that had occurred to these people who had lost their life savings effectively. And he finally complained to the Ombudsman. And, as we do, triage, you look into these things. In this case, a couple of my staff went to look at the files in the Department of Health, and they came back and said, it's appalling. So I launched a formal investigation, and I met Alan Lorraine. I remember meeting him, and he was challenging. What can you do about this? Polite. He was determined. So did the investigation, did it really quickly, because it was actually quite obvious, what had gone wrong. And during the investigation, wrote to the minister to say that I was minded to recommend that the government make an ex gratia payment to these people because of all of the failings of the department. And knowing that governments do not make ex gratia payments lightly, I was putting them on notice. So I finished the investigation, and I made a formal recommendation. I referred to my early contact with the minister, and said, I'm making a formal recommendation that they make this payment by the end of June. And this was April.
And this is a public document.
Public document.
Being tabled in Parliament.
Absolutely. And I met the families twice during, the beginning of the investigation with Alan Lorraine, and again on the day that I tabled the report. And it was, there were lots of tears. It was incredibly moving, because people felt I think they felt validated by, and Alan Lorraine was so right, because he just knew instinctively. I think he'd been an accountant, he knew that something had gone wrong there, and that they could not themselves be blamed for what had happened. And I remember being, having these questions being shot at me from the audience saying, can the government bury your reports? Do they have to do what you recommend? And I said, well, first of all, they can't bury the reports because I table them in Parliament, they go on the website, they cannot be buried. But they don't have to do what I recommend. The Ombudsman's powers are persuasive. I cannot enforce my recommendations. But what I can do, and I will do, is monitor them. And that's what I did. When there was some hesitation on the part of government as to whether there should be this I won't use the word compensation, ex gratia scheme, I made it very clear that whether they accepted my recommendations or not was entirely a matter for the minister, but I intended to make it public. And the result of that was that everybody entitled to it got paid, and the government paid out, I think it was about something to the tune of $4 million. To these very elderly people who had lost everything. And yes, and Alan Lorraine got an OAM for his efforts, which I was also very, very pleased about.
Well, you'll remain impartial, of course, Deborah, but I'll say another win for the good guys.
It did feel a bit that way, I have to say.
Deborah, it's been an enlightening and thoroughly interesting conversation this morning. We're drawing to a conclusion now, the close of it. When you look back, you've had a diverse and interesting career, starting from Bega and taking you back here to Melbourne with a lot of stops on the way. Any conclusions you've drawn? Any lessons you'd pass on to us or pass on to other people following you in the law? Well, sorry, not so much in the law, but other people following who've got a law degree, have got a legal qualification and are thinking about a career.
Don't plan. Don't plan too much. Be open to opportunities. Take some risks. As my own journey makes pretty clear, none of those things were... I could never have planned any of them. And so sometimes they're just milestones along the way that you encounter and think, oh, that looks like a good idea. And sometimes you'll find something that, that really inspires you. But trust your values. Take risks.
Trust your values and take risks. Sounds like very good advice to me. You're too young, Deborah, to have finished your working career now. What is in the future for you?
Yes, that's always a difficult one. I was asked this question quite a lot in my last week on the roll, and I said then, and I have to repeat this now, that when you take on a job like Ombudsman, you've got to be prepared for it to be your last big job, because if you do it well, and I hope I did, you're not likely to get another one.
Not from government anyway.
And what else is there? When you've spent pretty much your life working in the public interest, and you've done what I think is the best job in the state. Everything else, just looks a bit pallid. But look, I'm sure there is something out there. I intend to not spend all of my time in the garden. I'll be doing plenty of that. I do grow vegetables, but I'm open to opportunities.
Which is your advice to those coming along?
Absolutely.
Deborah, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful morning listening to your life in the law.
My pleasure.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.